Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and part 2 of the Ruth Ellis story. Initially this was going to be the final part, yet as I delved into Ruth's story, there were details I felt were important to cover. While the murder itself was swift, the build-up to it was gradual, with seemingly small things coming together to create the avalanche of emotions that drove the 28-year-old to pull the trigger. Therefore, with today's episode, I will explore who David Blakely was and the relationship he had with Ruth Ellis. David Moffat Drummond Blakely was born on the 17th of June 1929, the youngest of Annie and John's 4 children. He was brought into a privileged life, dwelling in a 4-bedroomed home with a nanny and access to a good education. His father John was a successful doctor who ran his own practice in Sheffield. With the NHS still a decade away, his patients were expected to pay for treatment. Yet John had earned a reputation of not turning anyone away due to the lack of funds. His kindness and professionalism, combined with his wholesome family life, made him a well-respected man. This respectable facade would be broken when it emerged that Dr. John Blakely had been conducting an affair, which had started when his son was just 3 years old. Yet 2 years after its commencement, the adulterous relationship would come to a tragic and suspicious end. 48-year-old Dr. Blakely had met 24-year-old Phyllis Stanton in 1932, when she was working as a waitress. He would later admit that the affair between them had been an infatuation for him, and the pair would meet daily over the next 2 years. However, things would change when Phyllis discovered she was pregnant. He would later tell police that he was not Phyllis's only lover, and that there were 3 other potential fathers. Yet he suspected she had picked him because he had the financial means to support her and the child, which he offered to do. He also claimed he told the recently unemployed Phyllis, who was living with her parents, that she had to have the child, despite her inquiring about an abortion, which he advised her was illegal. With John alleging he showed her a newspaper story about another doctor being prosecuted for carrying out the procedure. He would go on to state that Phyllis had contacted him in January, fearful that she was having a miscarriage, which she did not want to happen at her parents' home, as they were still unaware of the pregnancy. And so on the 15th of January 1934, he collected Phyllis from her parents' home and took her to stay with her friend Gladys Bailey, located on the opposite side of Sheffield to her family's home. Here the 25-year-old would share a room with 2 other women. To explain this move to her parents, Phyllis told them she had found a job, and to maintain the pretense, she wrote to her mother regularly. Dr. Blakely was a frequent visitor to Gladys's home, with her later noting that he would often come up to 3 times a day, bringing with him food for Phyllis. Gladys recalled that on the 27th of January she had gone to the cinema, leaving the pair alone, and when she returned Dr. Blakely was gone, and Phyllis had a red pinprick mark on her arm. That night Phyllis went to bed, and did not get up for the rest of the week, with Dr. Blakely still conducting his daily visits, this time with an attaché case and informing Gladys that Phyllis was ill. On one of his visits, Gladys noticed that he arrived with just his case, but left with it and a brown parcel. But at the time she thought nothing of this. Yet she had become concerned for her friend and suggested that if Phyllis was so ill, perhaps she should go home to be with her family. A week after the pinprick mark had appeared on Phyllis's arm, the pale and weak 25-year-old got dressed and was given a mixture of sherry and milk before John Blakely assisted her into his car and drove away. At about 6 p.m, Phyllis knocked on the back door of her family home, collapsing into her sister Elizabeth's arms as the door was opened. It was evident she was very ill, with her barely able to exclaim, "Oh, mother, I shall die." They briefly saw the rear lights of a car disappearing down the street, and Phyllis was only able to tell them that the doc had dropped her off. The family were aware that she had been having an affair with a married man, but did not know his identity, and in that moment, her well-being took priority. Having been taken to bed that night, her family attempted to make the young woman comfortable, but her condition worsened, and by the following morning, upon the recommendation of their GP, Dr. Gilmore, Phyllis was admitted to hospital, where she was diagnosed with septicemia. In a feverish state, she told those treating her that she had fallen down some stairs a few days earlier, yet failed to mention the pregnancy, nor Dr. Blakely's involvement. As the day progressed, her condition deteriorated, and by that evening, Phyllis Stanton had passed away. A post-mortem was subsequently carried out, which revealed that Phyllis had been 4 months pregnant, with evidence that she had suffered a miscarriage roughly 5 days prior to her death, but there was no injuries consistent with a fall. With the patient having failed to mention the pregnancy, and the lack of evidence to suggest the miscarriage had occurred naturally, combined with there being no sign of any interference, such as an abortion, it was deemed suspicious enough to involve the police. During their inquiries, Dr. John Blakely's name was raised, and he was invited to the local police station to give a statement, during which he confessed to having an affair with Phyllis, and acknowledged he knew about the baby, advising detectives that Phyllis had suffered a miscarriage on the 30th of January, yet he had told her to seek treatment from another doctor due to their intimate relationship. He told the police he may have been morally wronged for committing adultery, yet he had not done anything illegal that would have resulted in Phyllis's death. These statements would be challenged by evidence found in Phyllis's bedroom. During a search, police discovered a diary which contained a timetable for inducing labour. The handwriting in it was confirmed to be Dr. Blakely's by 2 chemists. They also found a box containing medication, including a vial of pituitrin, a drug known to be used to induce labour. When confronted with this evidence, John Blakely denied knowing anything about these items and went on to insinuate that Phyllis had acquired the pituitrin from elsewhere. However, the police felt that they had enough to proceed with a prosecution, and on the 20th of February 1934, Dr. Blakely appeared at Sheffield Magistrates Court for a pre-trial hearing. By this time, various newspapers had taken up the story, revealing to the public, including John's patients, the affair and the death. This once respected man's professional and private life was now under scrutiny as he stood in court that day. The prosecutor, Mr. Chance, outlined their case against the doctor, informing the room, quote, "The medical evidence of the post-mortem examination, which is very material, is that Phyllis Stanton died from acute septicemia following an abortion. In the submission of the prosecution, this abortion was procured by Dr. Blakely in such a way, with his knowledge of medicine, that it was extremely unlikely that anything would be found to implicate him." Mr. Chance then brought up the presence of the pituitrin recovered from Phyllis Stanton's bedroom, and having explained that it is commonly used to induce labour, the prosecutor added that due to it being a naturally occurring substance in everybody with varying amounts, it proves virtually impossible to prove whether it had been added to an individual's system. Despite this, there was other evidence that suggested wrongdoing on the doctor's part. Gladys had witnessed a tiny pinprick, possibly where the drug had been administered, and the following day Phyllis became bedbound. And despite Dr. Blakely's insistence that he refused to treat his lover, he began appearing at the home with his practitioner's bag, suggesting he was administering aid to the sick girl. Gladys had also told the police about the brown paper parcel Dr. Blakely had left her home with, which the prosecution would surmise contained the remains of the deceased child, although the whereabouts of this parcel could not be traced. Adding to this was a statement made to police by Dr. Blakely himself, in which he admitted having given Phyllis pituitrin, although he denied doing so in order to induce labour. It would be the evidence of Dr. Clark, who carried out the initial post-mortem, which would change the course of the proceedings. During cross-examination, he told the court that he had found nothing to indicate the administration of drugs, or evidence that an abortion had been carried out. He was asked whether a skilled medical practitioner would have the ability to carry out an abortion without leaving a trace, to which the doctor confirmed it was possible. and he was also asked where he stood on the administering of pituitrin to a woman who was 4 months pregnant. Dr. Clark responded that he would not use the drug on a pregnant woman. With his medical assessment being issued, proceedings were adjourned until the following day, when, utilising the testimony of Dr. Clark, the defence called for the dismissal of the charges on the ground that there was no concrete evidence that an abortion had taken place. Nor was there anything to suggest that the miscarriage had been anything other than natural. Having heard the defence's submission, the judge agreed with their points, stating, "I have carefully considered this case, and have come to the conclusion that the evidence on both charges is so weak that no jury would convict." With no solid evidence to take the case to trial, the charges against Dr. Blakely were dropped, and he walked free from the courtroom, with his reputation intact. His attempts to portray Phyllis as a woman with loose morals failed. It was revealed by Detective Sergeant Burstow that there was nothing to suggest that Phyllis had been seeing anyone else. Yet none of this mattered, as the 25-year-old's life had come to a tragic end. For the doctor, the trial had no impact on his professional standing. He returned to his practice, where he continued to be a popular and well-respected man. This was not reflected in his home life, with it being the catalyst for the breakdown of his marriage. David would bear witness to his parents' disintegrating relationship on the occasions he returned home from his boarding school, Hillstone Preparatory School in Malvern, which he started attending when he was 5. In recent years there had been allegations made that the head teacher of the school, Rudolph Simpson, and his wife Barbara physically abused many of the pupils in their care. However, whether David experienced any abuse is unknown. He remained at the school until he was 11 years old, by which time his parents' marriage had completely disintegrated, with them divorcing in 1940. Annie cited adultery as part of the cause for her filing, although David would later tell Ruth that his parents separated because his father had become physically abusive. But as his claim was allegedly made during an argument, it is hard to know whether it was truthful or was said to elicit a response from his lover. Just 3 months after the divorce was finalised, Annie remarried, with David's new stepfather being Humphrey Cook, a wealthy man who had inherited his father's successful drapery business and a substantial fortune. Humphrey moved his new family into a home in the affluent Park Lane area of London, while they would also spend time at a second home located in the village of Pen in Buckinghamshire. It was through his new stepfather that David would be introduced to the world of motor racing, as Humphrey had previously been a driver and had invested in motorsports. He also wanted his stepson to have a good education, and arranged for David to attend Shrewsbury School, where he became a boarder in the summer of 1943 at the age of 13. With his older siblings having begun their own lives, getting married and pursuing successful careers, it was hoped that David would follow in their footsteps. But this failed to be the case. Throughout his time at the school, he was seen as a poor pupil, whose lack of concentration, drive or ambition was noted on numerous occasions by his tutors. It was also alleged by a fellow pupil that David had been a bully at school, who seemed to delight in other people's suffering. At the end of his time at Shrewsbury, David had failed to pass the minimum 5 subjects required to achieve his certificate of education, meaning he was unable to go on to attend university. With his disappointing academic performance, it was hoped that the compulsory military service he had to undertake would give him a much-needed purpose in life, with him training at the renowned Sandhurst. Yet having joined the Royal Tank Regiment and being granted a commission with the Highland Light Infantry, his military career proved brief, with him returning to London in 1949, where he was housed by his stepfather in a home a few doors away from their own house. His mother and stepfather continued to support the now 20-year-old, with him being provided an allowance of £20 a week, the equivalent of £580 today. He lived his life believing he would always have a financial security net, and this may have impacted his seeming lack of purpose. He had shown an interest in motor racing, a subject that he and Humphrey had bonded over, and on David's 21st birthday he was gifted a HRG motorcar, which would quickly become David's passion project, igniting his desire to become a racing driver. Humphrey Cook was happy to help his stepson pursue his goal, but also wanted him to learn the value of money and forge a career that he could fall back on should he not achieve his ambition. Through his connections, Humphrey was able to secure David work at the exclusive Hyde Park Hotel, where the 21-year-old would be employed as a trainee manager. Yet David had no interest in the job. He balked at the meagre wages and the long hours, with him proving to be an unreliable employee. He found the only benefit to the role was that it gave him the opportunity to meet women. Humphrey was held in high esteem, and before dismissing David, the management at the hotel contacted his stepfather, who persuaded them to give him another chance. However, despite Humphrey telling the 21-year-old to improve his attitude, his words failed to change David's ways. However, the hotel did as Humphrey had requested, and gave David more time. David did show his determination in another area, with him focusing his energy on the sports car he received for his birthday. Knowing he needed someone more mechanically minded, David would call upon a man he had recently met who had been selling a car. Although the car sale didn't proceed, David struck up a friendship with Anthony Findlater, who had the skills David lacked, and so he asked him to assist in getting the car ready to head to the track. Anthony, who shared a similar background to David, they both came from wealthy families and had a love of racing instilled in them by a parental figure, quickly became a close friend, and alongside his wife Carol, the trio would often be seen socialising together. Splitting the costs of making the car race ready, David and Anthony spent most of their spare time working on the vehicle, and their hard work began to pay off, with David as the driver. The car placed third during one of its first races. Yet off the track, David jeopardised his new partnership when he began an affair with Carol Findlater, who would use her job as a journalist to cover her movements, telling Anthony she was attending meetings when in actuality she was going to see David. It was a seemingly intense affair that resulted in Carol leaving her husband for a short while, although Anthony did not know the reason why. Carol would later tell police, quote, "I left my husband to live with David Blakely. We were in love, at least we felt we were. It was a pretty serious business, although there was a number of difficulties, mainly financial. After a few months, I returned to my husband." Upon her return, she told Anthony the reason for her absence, but assured him that the relationship with David was over. Ultimately, the pair opted to reconcile. Yet when she told David that Anthony knew about the affair, his main concern was not how his friend reacted, but who would help him with the car. The affair seemed to have no long-lasting implications for the trio, as Carol and Anthony reunited and continued their friendship with David. Carol later reflected on their relationship, stating, "I came to regard David as a dear and close friend, but not my lover." If the car had been his passion prior to 1952, his father's death in February that year would cause David to focus more attention on the project. Dr. John Blakely had continued practicing medicine in Sheffield, and upon his passing he was still held in high regard amongst his patients. The father of four had also ensured his children had been looked after in his will, with him leaving each of them an inheritance of £7,000, or roughly £160,000 in today's money. David opted to use his inheritance to develop his own racing car, which would prove to be his detriment, as it would be reported after his death that David Blakely was virtually penniless when he died. He had grown up never having to worry about money, and so losing his job at the Hyde Park Hotel in October 1952 didn't faze David. To him, the wages were meaningless, and the role unfulfilling. He preferred being on the racetrack, where he was proving himself to be a very competent driver. Placing in the top 3 in numerous races, he was becoming a rising star on the scene. Yet Humphrey, ever concerned for his stepson's financial future, still wanted him to have other options, and once again he encouraged David to get another job. This time, Humphrey helped him secure a role at Silicon Pistons, which was located in the village of Penn in Buckinghamshire, where his mother and stepfather had their second home. This new job was more fulfilling for David, who was also excelling on the racetrack, becoming ingrained into the world of motorsports. He began socialising with other drivers and enthusiasts, whose favourite drinking spots tended to be the bars and clubs of London, including the Steering Wheel Club and the Little Club. As he became ingrained in the scene, David also became acquainted with Desmond Cousin, a quiet man who shared a love of motor racing, but lacked the social prowess that David exuded. It would be through their connection with motorsport and the frequenting of the London clubs that David and Desmond would meet Ruth Ellis, and both would play a key role in her journey to the news. While David Blakely had been making a name for himself on the racing circuits, Ruth had been trying to get her life back on track following the disastrous 2 years leading up to 1953. But now, with her separated from her alcoholic and abusive husband George Ellis, and having recently recovered from an ectopic pregnancy, Ruth hoped that New Year would bring her better fortune. By the summer of 1953, Ruth had embraced her newly single lifestyle. Her popularity amongst the regular clientele at Carol's, which was formerly the Court Club, was at her high, especially now she was sporting a new blonde curly bob, which was a favourite of the pin-up girls of the era. It was during this time she also started modelling, and took the more risque photographs which would be circulated in the newspapers shortly after the murder. As the middle of the year approached, Ruth would become acquainted with a quiet, well-spoken and wealthy Desmond Cousin, who was a fairly attractive man in his early 30s, but came across as reserved and lacked charisma. He was the polar opposite of David Blakely, who shared a similar privileged life, yet he seemed interesting and exciting, although from Ruth's first encounter with him, one would wonder why a relationship formed at all. Ruth noticed a brash young man enter the Carol Club one evening. Dressed in an old racing jacket, he exuded confidence as he strutted up to the bar. Yet, after having a couple of drinks, he became rude to the hostesses and other patrons, including a group that Ruth was drinking with, who were all members of the racing scene. When she inquired who the rude individual was, she was informed that he was also a driver called David Blakely. This incident left a less than favourable impression on her, as upon him exiting the bar she said to her companion, "I hope I don't see him again." David, however, entered Ruth's life just as things were starting to change for the better. Maurice Conley, the owner of Carol's, offered Ruth the position of manageress at another of his establishments, called the Little Club. Promotion came with a flat, situated above the club, which she could live in rent-free, and a substantial pay rise. Located on the Brompton Road, within the vicinity of high-end boutiques and Harrods, the Little Club was situated on the first floor of a 5-storey Dutch-style terrace, while Ruth's new flat would be found on the second floor, with the additional floors being rented out to hostesses who worked at the club. The flat itself had a sitting room, kitchen and 2 bedrooms, which meant that her children, Andre and Georgina, could finally live with her. The living space was sufficient that her mother, Berta, could spend the night to look after the children. With all the benefits that came with the position that had made her the youngest club manager in London, there were also its drawbacks. The club owner, Maurice Conley, still expected Ruth and her hostesses to offer sexual services to himself and the club clients. And although he did not install a madam at the club, as he had done at others, he entrusted Ruth to fulfil the role. Despite the flat's prestigious location and clientele, the salacious activities that took place in the flat above Ruth's, which was used by hostesses to service clients, could make for an uncomfortable living situation. On one occasion, Muriel paid her sister a visit and recalled hearing the sound of intercourse coming from upstairs. It was a stark reminder of the life her sister was leading. Yet it was also clear that Ruth was earning a good wage, which prompted Muriel to admit that she was envious of her younger sister. Ruth admonished her and pointed out that, quote, "It would take 10 years off anyone's life." Although it was not an ideal living space for her 2 children, it finally allowed Ruth to have them with her. The hours were better suited to family life, and the pay meant she could give them a better upbringing. For her opening night as manager, the club was crowded with patrons, yet one man caught her attention. This time David Blakely was on his best behaviour, and Ruth found herself engaged in conversation with him regarding their shared interests. That night she noticed his dark hair and brown eyes, which were framed by curly lashes. She later admitted that she had begun to find him vaguely interesting. Remarking on the stark contrast between their first two encounters, Ruth stated, "He was completely charming, almost shy. Perhaps it was because he was on his own. He was certainly better dressed this time." David would become a regular at the club, often staying until closing time at 11 p.m. Ruth was fascinated with how he flirted with other women, and one night she thought she would try her luck with him, purposely inviting a fellow hostess to join her in the flat after work, within earshot of David. To her delight, he asked if he could join them, to which Ruth stated he could. That night, after the hostess had gone home, David stayed, and he and Ruth shared a bed for the first time. Despite her later claims that she didn't fall for him that night, within 2 weeks, David was living in the flat with Ruth and her children. There is a question regarding how seriously David considered their connection. Granted, he spent a lot of time at Ruth's flat, but he was reluctant to take her to his bachelor flat, or the annexed apartment he had at his mother's home in Penn. While David saw Ruth as someone he enjoyed spending time with, it is questionable whether his mother would have seen the peroxide blonde club hostess as a suitable candidate to marry her son. By marrying Humphrey Cook, David's mother, who had also come from a privileged background, had become a part of high society, where reputation and marrying someone with the right breeding was important. Although Ruth's best friend Vicky had managed to climb the social ladder, she had done so from a reasonably young age and had become ingratiated with the right contacts to help her become a social starlet. Yet Ruth's lifestyle and past proved a barrier to her advancing her social standing. The disparity between David's and Ruth's worlds would be brought into focus when on the 11th of November 1953, it was announced in the Times newspaper that David Blakely was engaged to Mary Newton Dawson, the youngest daughter of a wealthy wool manufacturer from Yorkshire. Mary Newton Dawson represented his mother's ideal choice for her son's wife. She was unchaste and from a respectable family. This engagement must have made Ruth feel that although she interacted with highly influential people as clients at her club, she was not in fact a part of their world. David was living between the two worlds. He would join his fiancée at high society events, while he and Ruth would frequent the bars and clubs of London, with him being careful not to allow his two lives to meet. Even though he was engaged, David and Ruth continued their relationship, and in March 1954, Ruth learned she was expecting his child. She would later advise her solicitor about the situation, recalling that David was aware of the pregnancy, but that she, quote, "didn't intend to take advantage of such a position. My pregnancy was in fact terminated. I did not ask him for, and he did not offer me any money for the operation, although at that time he certainly had some." In this statement, Ruth makes it sound like the abortion was a choice, yet medical records would suggest that it was not a viable pregnancy, with the egg implanting in the fallopian tube. The baby would not have come to term, and the procedure would have had to be performed for the sake of Ruth's health. 2 months after the loss of this baby, Ruth would be confronted with the dilemma of letting one of her children go, when George Ellis arrived in London and paid his estranged wife a visit at the flat. He had come to discuss whether Ruth would consent to a divorce, which she was still reluctant to do. Yet he also had a suggestion for their daughter Georgina. During his visit, he voiced his concern that the flat was not a suitable place for their child, and accused Ruth of being an unfit mother. He then proceeded to tell Ruth about Phyllis and Peter Lawton, who were unable to have children and would be willing to care for Georgina without the Ellises relinquishing their parental rights. The childless couple lived up north in Warrington, and if Ruth agreed, Georgina would be living in their home with George. At the time, Ruth had been struggling to get childcare for the 2-year-old. Her parents had gone to work as domestic servants and were unable to provide the support they used to, and Ruth was nervous to let a stranger care for her child. Reluctantly, she agreed to let George take his daughter, to whom he was virtually a stranger. Georgina later reported that on the train ride north, her father drank excessively, and upon meeting Phyllis and Peter, he introduced Mrs. Lawton as her new mother. She would go on to express that she grew fond of the Lawtons, who provided her with a good life. But Georgina also has memories of her drunken father stumbling around in the bedroom they shared, yet she also had a treasured memory of him being an exquisite piano player. Georgina also had abiding recollections of her mother, recalling the blonde locks of hair and Ruth's favourite perfume, Miss Dior. The pair would write frequently to each other, yet a year after they had been parted, Ruth would commit the crime that would separate them forever. While Ruth was recovering from the loss of one baby and feeling the absence of her daughter, David's friends Anthony and Carol found later were delivered a daughter in May 1954 and named David as the child's godfather. Despite having a newborn baby, Anthony was spending up to 18 hours a day away from his wife and child, with him and David designing and building a new car, which would be known as the Emperor. Yet instead of returning straight home at the end of the workday, the two men would then go out drinking together, much to the disdain of both Carol and Ruth, who also hated that David was away for long periods. And David tried to make up for his absences by taking Ruth to race meets at the weekend. She recalled joining him in the car for practice runs, and the thrill of travelling at 100 miles per hour around the track, yet feeling completely safe while he was at her side. At the meets, she would become acquainted with the wives of other drivers and members of the racing scene. But once again, class would play a part in her ability to integrate with them, with Anthony Feinleiter recalling she did not fit in. She stuck out like a sore thumb. David, being from a wealthy family, was already well ingrained into this hierarchy, and was accustomed to living a frivolous life. Yet he was about to realise that his financial safety net wasn't as secure as he first thought. The Emperor was consuming most of David's money, and he had gone to his stepfather for more funds. But Humphrey refused, having learned that the 24-year-old had been spending the cash in the bars and pubs of London. Wanting to teach his stepson a lesson on responsibility, he offered to help David save money on the rental of the garage space by letting him store the Emperor at his home in Penn, and encouraged the 24-year-old to manage his finances better. Despite Ruth being in a much worse financial situation, David would take advantage of her generosity, with him telling her that his money was tied up in the new car. She offered to let him stay in the flat rent-free and drink in the club without charge. When the owner of the little club, Maurice Conley, discovered this arrangement, he was displeased. He had already warned Ruth about mixing her private life and business, and he disagreed with her showing David preferential treatment. As punishment, he told Ruth she would have to start paying £10 a week in rent, an additional cost she could ill afford. In June 1954, David would head to France to compete in the 24-hour race in Le Mans, with him assuring Ruth he would be back in London on Tuesday the 15th, in time for his birthday. And so on the 17th she put on a surprise 25th birthday party for him at the little club, yet he failed to turn up. Having not heard anything from David to say he was delayed, Ruth felt hurt by his absence. And in an act of possible spitefulness, she turned to a man she knew would make David jealous, Desmond's cousin, whom she would spend the night with in the flat above the club. She admitted she had no feelings for Desmond, and claimed that she only used him in the hopes that David would find out. Desmond would later tell police about their night together, in which he told them, "She asked me to stay with her, and pointed out that she wasn't married to him, and she was entitled to lead her own life. Later she told me she had thrown him out twice, but he kept coming back. She said he drank a lot. From what I gathered, he never gave her any money to support herself." This would be the first of many occasions where she would turn to Desmond for comfort and support, becoming increasingly reliant on him as her relationship with David spiralled. Yet whatever feelings she had for Desmond were not expressed in the bedroom. For a woman who many complimented for her sexual prowess, he claimed that she was, quote, very mechanical. Those who complimented her ability in the bedroom had usually paid for the experience, so she had an incentive to perform, while men who were her lovers she was sexually attracted to, whereas she was not attracted to Desmond, and he was not paying for her services. which may explain this disparity in his encounters with her. Ruth's hopes that David would find out about her dalliance with Desmond would come to fruition when she received a postcard from him, which he signed off, P.S. Love to Desmond. Despite her claims she had done it to break off the relationship with David, when he returned to London at the beginning of July, she threw him a belated birthday party. She admitted later that it was seeing David again that made her realise how much she missed and cared about him. After the party ended, the pair retired to the flat above the club, where they argued about how rude David had been to the guests at the party. Yet things took a turn when he revealed that he wanted to be with her, and had called off his engagement with Mary Newton Dawson. This revelation ignited Ruth's hopes that there was a future for them. She recalled later that he became more attentive, showering her with affection, and she confessed that despite being adamant she wouldn't allow herself to become emotionally involved with a man after previous experiences, Ruth admitted, quote, "I'm afraid I allowed myself to become very attached to him. I put him on the highest of pedestals. He could do nothing wrong. I trusted him implicitly. I still, however, did not think seriously about marriage. I myself was still married, and I believed from what he had told me about his family that his mother would never allow such a match." The one thing that David was unable to offer Ruth was financial support, and for that she would turn to Desmond, often without David's knowledge. It was thanks to Desmond that Ruth was able to send 10-year-old Andre to an exclusive boarding school in Shrewsbury, with him covering the tuition and uniform costs. He even posed as her husband when she attended a meeting with the head teacher prior to Andre's admittance in September of that year. David and Ruth's relationship would change drastically by October of 1954. It had been building up for months, with him becoming increasingly jealous of how she interacted with customers in the club. He despised her working there, especially when she slept with clients for extra money. He would urge Ruth to leave, despite the fact that it was her income that was covering their bills. Ruth recalled how he would insult and belittle her in front of her patrons in the club. He made her feel inferior, and in turn her general health and demeanour suffered, alongside her increased alcohol consumption. She recalled, "Instead of being cheerful and contented, I was becoming moody and ill-tempered," with her also recognising that it was becoming bad for business. Much worse was to come, as his verbal abuse would turn to physical assaults, and unlike George Ellis, whose violence was kept to the privacy of their home, David didn't seem to care who witnessed his attacks on Ruth. One witness to many of these beatings would be Ruth's friend and fellow hostess, Jacqueline Dyer, who recalled that David would often be drunk when he flew into a jealous rage and would beat Ruth, sometimes hitting her across the face while in the club, or during a loud altercation in the flat above. Jacqueline recalled that on one occasion he pushed Ruth down a flight of stairs, and that her friend was often covered in bruises. David and Ruth's relationship had been built on a foundation of jealousy and mistrust. Both of them conducted affairs, and they would enter into a vicious cycle in which an argument would turn to violence, leading them to separate, only for them to reunite, enjoying a short period of passion before they repeated the cycle again. It was often David who pursued Ruth after a split, calling her, sending her flowers, and promising her that things would change. He would also threaten to harm himself if she didn't come back to him, saying he couldn't live without her. His persistence would wear her down, and she'd let him back in. Some, however, claim that Ruth wasn't entirely innocent, alleging that she had assaulted David on a number of occasions, with witnesses such as Faith Roberts, a woman he was having an affair with, stating she had seen the injuries on David's body. These included knife marks, which he claimed were from Ruth trying to stab him. He also told Faith and numerous other people that he was scared of Ruth and terrified of what she would do if he tried to leave her. Faith Roberts would be the cause of another argument between the couple, when Ruth noticed the love bites on David's neck. He confessed he had been seeing Faith, prompting Ruth to throw him out of the flat and tell him the relationship was over. An hour later David rang Ruth, but she didn't answer. He called again in the morning, begging her to take him back. She refused. and so he turned up at the flat, where Ruth claimed he got on his knees sobbing and promised to make it up to her. He promised to marry her, even if his parents didn't approve. This incident would be presented differently in the Woman's Sunday Mirror, who got the exclusive rights to publish Ruth's story after the trial. In the newspaper, David apparently came to the flat to plead for Ruth to take him back. But when she refused, he went outside and threatened to throw himself under a bus if she didn't forgive him. As stated in the previous episode, the writer of the exclusive admitted years later that some of the articles were embellished. So with at least two versions of this incident, it is hard to know which is truthful. Yet from statements made by Ruth to the police and in court, it is likely that even if he hadn't threatened to hurt himself on this occasion, he had done so at least once, as Ruth claimed that this was part of the reason she would take him back despite the abuse. After this incident, she did take him back, and with his claims that he would marry her, even against his parents' wishes, Ruth was once again lulled into a sense of hopefulness. With David no longer engaged, the only barrier to their future happiness was the fact that on paper, she was still married to George. To rectify this, Ruth agreed to the divorce. She declined an allowance from her estranged husband and handed him custody of Georgina, although it would be a while till it was finalised. Ruth was prepared to do anything to be with David, allowing her love for him to overrule all other aspects of her life. Later reflecting on this, Ruth said, "It was a measure of my love for David that I was prepared to give up my child of whom I was most fond." Ruth was besotted with David, and she once again believed he could do no wrong, until he proved her otherwise. Near the end of 1954, David promised to take Ruth to Paris for a weekend away. Having never been abroad and excited to spend time with the man she loved, Ruth was left disappointed when he called to say the flight had been cancelled due to bad weather. She didn't question his claim until the following day when she read that a famous actress had arrived in Paris by plane. With her interest piqued, she rang the airline, who confirmed that no flights had been cancelled the previous night. This was the first time to her knowledge that he had lied to her. It left her devastated and distrustful. At around the same time, matters were made worse when Ruth learned about the affair David had with Carol Findlater, a woman she had already disliked. Ruth now had more reason to feel uneasy about David spending time at the Findlaters' home, even though the affair had been over for some time. As Ruth's suspicions and distrust grew, the violent arguments worsened, still taking place in front of witnesses, including Ruth's mother, Berta. David also turned his aggression on other clients in the little club, and the atmosphere had become so uncomfortable that some members started drinking elsewhere. Naturally, this had implications for the business, with it plummeting in profitability. Maurice Connolly was furious, and whether she left or was fired, Ruth ceased working at the little club on the 7th of December, 1954. Losing the job meant losing the flat too, and with nowhere to go, Ruth turned to Desmond for help, and he agreed to take her and Andre in until she found a job and somewhere to live. Desmond claimed he did this purely to help her out. He denied that he and Ruth were lovers, although he alleged they still had sex occasionally. There had always been a rivalry between Desmond and David when it came to Ruth, so it is not surprising that David disliked her new living situation, although Ruth quelled his concerns by claiming she was only using Desmond until she was able to get her own place. Ruth, however, told Desmond that she had ended things with David and just wanted to move on with her life. What Ruth didn't tell him was that she was still meeting up with David, with the pair checking into a hotel under the name Mr. and Mrs. Blakely, while Desmond was under the impression that Ruth had either gone to see friends or was visiting Georgina in Warrington. Trouble would stir up again between the couple over Christmas 1954, which they spent apart. Ruth stayed with Desmond and Andre, while David went to his parents' home in Penn. With him absent, Ruth decided to have a get-together with friends, and went out for pre-party drinks at a local club, unaware that an inebriated David had made his way back to London. David called at Desmond's flat and found a note pinned to the door, with a telephone number of the club Ruth and her friends had gone to. Knocking on the door, it was opened by 10-year-old Andre, who was home alone but let David in. Despite the often fraught relationship between David and the boy's mother, he had a soft spot for Andre and had purchased a toy gun, which he gave the child as a Christmas present. David stayed in the flat until Ruth and her friends returned from the club, at which point he proceeded to chastise her for leaving Andre alone, even though she had done this regularly when she went out with him. The argument escalated and turned to Ruth's suspicions that David was cheating, this time accusing him of sleeping with Carol Finelater. Keen to prove her wrong, the pair left the home and headed to Carol and Anthony's flat, for which David had a key. He failed to tell Ruth that the couple had gone away for Christmas, so the property was empty, but they went inside anyway. Outside the flat, Desmond, who had driven after the pair, waited in his car for them to exit the property, but after a while he realised that they were not going to appear, and so he headed back to his home, apologised to the party guests, and ensured Andre was settled in bed. The following morning Ruth returned to explain her absence. She alleged that she had had to stay with David, who was so drunk and depressed that she feared he would actually hurt himself. Despite her claim that the pair hadn't reunited, later that day she joined David to see the Emperor's debut race at Brands Hatch, where it placed second and garnered a lot of press coverage, praising the new car and its driver. While David seemed happy to have Ruth at his side at the racetrack, it was evident he still was unwilling to allow her access to other aspects of his life, as he proved on New Year's Eve when he offered to take Ruth for a drink at the Crown pub in Penn. His mother was currently staying at their second home in the village, and sometimes frequented the Crown public house, so there was a prospect that this would lead to David introducing Ruth to his mother. However, when they pulled up outside the pub, David told Ruth to stay in the car, while he went inside. He quickly came back out and told her they were leaving. This enraged Ruth, who accused him of purposely avoiding his mother. The argument turned violent when David punched Ruth in the face. Their journey back home to London was filled with silence, and Ruth told David it was over as he dropped her off at Desmond's flat. Once again her words would be meaningless, as she took him back again, while insisting to Desmond that she was only meeting up with David as a friend because she felt sorry for him and feared for his well-being. Meanwhile, David continued to insist to anyone who'd listen that he didn't want anything to do with Ruth, but his actions contradicted his words, as he continued to pursue her and lulled her into the belief that he wanted a future together. Yet his words would prove hollow. His violent outbursts would continue, and his physical and emotional abuse towards Ruth would drive her to murder. Join me next time as I continue to explore David and Ruth's tumultuous relationship, the murder, and its aftermath.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.